What supernatural creatures inhabit our world? Are these creatures from this or another dimension? For a group of friends from a small town, this question would come in a frightening way. It was a Friday, and everyone was anxious to get out of school. No one was listening to the teachers. After all, it was Friday. The second the bell rang, everyone flew out of the school and went to enjoy the weekend. Our town is relatively small and was founded between 1880 and 1890. I don't remember exactly. There's a lake in the city area. On a Friday night, in a small town like ours, teenagers get bored easily. Sure, you can watch TV and sit around, but that gets tiring easily. So desperate to free ourselves from a boring prison, my friends and I decided to venture out at night. We went to practically every place in the city that was possible to go. So we decided to go to the forest on the south side of the lake, a place that everyone subconsciously avoided going to. Since no one in our group had been there, we thought, we don't have anything better to do. We took the car of the older brother of a guy in our group and went there. We parked the car at the beginning of the trail that led to the lake and followed the rest of the way on foot. It was a narrow trail that went in and out of the forest. It was a warm evening with a nice breeze blowing on your face, reminding you that summer was already coming. We walked and arrived at a bridge. This bridge was very new. We stopped on it and started throwing rocks and went into the water, and we talked about school and other things. We were there talking when someone noticed that near the bridge there was a small old dock, but it wasn't just old, it was very old. The nails were so old that the rust turned them into little sticks. There was also a tree next to it, and the branches were bending and almost touching the water. Some branches reached all the way to the end of the dock. We were all looking at the water at the edge of the dock and noticed bubbles rising to the surface. At first we didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it might be a frog. But then the bubbles got bigger and rose faster and faster. Our eyes were glued to it. We had never seen anything like it. It was quite interesting until we saw what was doing it. The time it took us to run out and enter the forest was the time I had to take a look at it. It looked human. The skin was stuck to the bones. The eyes were something you can't easily forget. They were bulging out of the face, as if it had been hit in the head with a club. There was no life in them at all. When we were almost out of sight, I saw something that made my spine shiver. A hand came out of the water and rested on the floor of the dock, as if it were pulling something. When we got to the car, we jumped in. We were calmer inside and started laughing at each other's terrified faces. Suddenly, a rock a little smaller than a tennis ball came through the window. The laughter gave way to screams, and the car sped off. I was in the back seat with another guy, and on the floor behind the driver's seat was that wet, mossy rock. We never went back there. I don't remember that night, but my mother has told me this story so many times that it feels like I lived through it myself. And believe me, she never tells it with a laugh, never with dismissal. Always with that shadow in her eyes, as if reliving every second. It was summer, and my family, my parents and my two sisters, Julia and Luisa, decided to spend their vacation in Rio de Janeiro. They booked a spacious hotel room, one of those divided by an internal door. My parents would stay on one side, the girls on the other. The vacation was going great until that night. It was one of the last nights of the trip. The hotel was silent, the night deep. My older sister, Julia, started stirring in bed, whimpering softly, lost in an uneasy dream. On the other side of the room, Luisa couldn't sleep. She felt something strange, a weight on her chest, a cold that didn't match the summer heat, a terrible feeling. But it wasn't until the sensation became unbearable, like someone was there, watching, waiting to grab her, that she found the courage to move. She got out of bed and walked to our parents' door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the cold wood. The air felt thick. Finally, she knocked. Nothing. She tried again. No answer. Her breathing grew shallow. Then, she forced herself to speak and called for our mother. When the door opened, my mother was drowsy, blinking slowly. But then, she saw it. Behind Luisa, standing in the dark hallway, was an old woman. Wrinkled skin, eyes wide in an expression of pure terror. As if, in the moment of her death, she had been consumed by absolute horror. My mother didn't think. She just grabbed Louisa and pulled her into the room, holding her tight. But what happened next was worse. The old woman entered. She glided silently through the doorway, like a shadow, and disappeared into the bathroom. My mother let out a short, strangled scream, just enough to wake up my father and Julia, who immediately started crying. Between sobs, she said she had dreamed of an old woman chasing Louisa. And at that moment, fear turned into pure panic. Everyone huddled together on the bed, pressed close, too afraid to look toward the bathroom. They prayed until morning, unsure if they were truly alone in that room. The next day, my mother tried to make sense of it. She remembered that the woman seemed to be carrying something in her arms, stacked up. Towels, maybe a housekeeper, perhaps one who had spent her life in that hotel. Washing, folding, organizing, until she grew old, died, but never left. And that night, for some reason, she came back to finish her work, or to take someone with her. Sao Paulo, 1978. I was just a child when it happened, but my mother, she never forgot. It was a night like any other. My sister, my cousins, and I were sleeping in one of the rooms. My mother was in another. The house belonged to my aunt, my cousin's mother. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until my mother woke up. She first heard the sound in a dream, a rhythmic, metallic noise, persistent and unsettling. A spoon tapping against a glass. Tick, tick, tick. She opened her eyes, confused. But the sound continued. Still groggy, she turned on the bedroom light. When she opened the door to the hallway and flipped the switch, the noise stopped abruptly, as if something or someone realized it was being heard. She took a deep breath and walked toward the kitchen. Turned on the light. Everything was in place. No spoon, no glass out of order. Maybe it was a sound coming from a neighbor. She tried to ignore it and went back to bed. But as soon as she laid her head on the pillow, tick, 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 this time louder, closer. A chill ran down her spine. There was no doubt now. The sound was inside the apartment. She got up again, but as she opened the bedroom door, she froze. Every light in the house was on, except for the one in the room where we, the children, were sleeping. Her heart pounded. Logic told her that my aunt had probably arrived home and left the lights on. But why was everything so eerily silent? She called my aunt's name. No answer. With a growing sense of dread, she walked toward the kitchen. And that's when she saw it. The front door was wide open. A wave of cold fear washed over her. It wasn't my aunt, then, who had turned on the lights, who was inside the house. Her first thought was the most rational one. A burglar. Panic set in, but she didn't hesitate. She ran to our room to check on us. We were sound asleep, blissfully unaware of what was happening. Feeling vulnerable, she shut the apartment door and rushed downstairs to the playground to find the security guard. Minutes later, he came up with a gun in hand. They searched the entire apartment, the building's hallways, the stairwells, even the rooftop. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. No one hiding in the shadows. Relief washed over her, briefly. Something still felt wrong. She tried to shake it off, returned to bed, closed her eyes. Tick, tick, tick. The sound returned. Louder. She didn't hesitate this time. She rushed to our room, gathered us up, and left. We went upstairs to a neighbor's apartment, a close friend of the family. She let us in without question. But as she tried to calm my mother, she mentioned something unsettling. Her next-door neighbor had also been making strange noises. Moaning. My mother, already on edge, felt an icy dread settle in her chest. The neighbor, and she decided to check if the woman needed help. Her husband answered the door. He looked exhausted, but unsurprised. "Don't worry," he said. "She's talking to someone." "I'm used to it." "Talking to someone?" My mother asked, hesitant. He nodded. "My wife is a medium. Sometimes she speaks with the dead." My mother couldn't respond. She just sat on the couch, waiting for the sun to rise, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, the medium came to see my aunt. She told her to have a mass said for the soul of her late husband. He had been murdered 3 years earlier, in 1975. She never confirmed whether the events of that night were caused by him. But my aunt had no doubt. It was him, she said without hesitation. To her, the proof was undeniable. the sound of the spoon tapping against the glass. "I remember," she murmured. "He used to do that every night while preparing milk for our youngest daughter." That daughter, his youngest child, hadn't even been living there. She was in Salvador with my grandmother. And yet, that night, it was as if he had never left. Perhaps he never had. And to this day, my mother avoids the sound of a spoon tapping against glass. There was a large farmhouse in the middle of a 3-acre plot of land in a small town in the state of Minas Gerais, until it was demolished a few years ago. At the time, the land belonged to my wife's grandparents, who bought it in the spring of 1982 with the intention of building a house on one of the northern ends of the land, where the road was. The house was built, the land was fenced, and the rest of the land was used for their horses. After thinking about the idea of renovating the old house, which was over 60 years old, and turning it into a guest house, they simply decided to use it as a storage room. In the summer of 1997, my wife and I received an invitation from her grandparents to spend a few days at their farmhouse. So we packed our bags and left Juiz de Fora for a 3-hour drive, eager to spend a weekend in a quiet, rustic, and relaxing place. Just to be clear, I have always been fascinated by the paranormal, but my interest is focused on the more common aspects of the paranormal: horror and suspense books and movies, and the occasional TV documentaries. My wife, Larissa, on the other hand, has always had a more serious and active interest in the subject, and as a result of her past as a ghost hunter, she has a collection of photos that she herself has taken of spirits, and to complement it, some audio recordings for her EVP, Electronic Voices Phenomenon, or EVP audio library. The phenomenon of ghost photos, something that has been around since the invention of the camera itself, is something that, to my practical and rational mind, can easily be confused with accidental or not double exposure of film, the reflection of light, drops of water on the camera lens, in short, several coincidences. But what really catches my attention are the recordings that Larissa, has. Some of the anomalies I heard on the tapes could easily be mistaken for something earthly and paranormal. But there are still some that even a rational mind has to admit are beyond comprehension and plausible explanation. Anyway, despite having read and heard about such occurrences, I have never had any personal experience with the paranormal. Not until that weekend my wife and I spent at her grandparents' house in 1997. We arrived in the small town on a Friday night, and after chatting for a while and having a few cups of coffee with her grandparents, we decided to go to the bedroom. I was lying in bed talking to Larissa, still unable to sleep, and of course our conversation turned to the old house just 50 yards away from where we were. It was my first time there, and I was completely captivated by both the old look and the decrepit beauty of the old house, as well as its air of sadness and melancholy. I told Larissa how scary it looked under the light of the full moon when we arrived, and how it would be the perfect setting for one of the ghost stories I love to read so much on dark winter nights. I asked her what it was like inside, but she told me she didn't know. She had never been inside. I thought this was strange. My wife had a voracious appetite for anything that looked scary. It was normal for her to explore cemeteries and other places with potential for haunting at night, armed only with a flashlight, a recorder, and a camera. Her answer was simple: my grandfather never let me in. He's afraid the ceiling will collapse on me. With that, my curiosity was satisfied. But at breakfast the next morning, the little seed of curiosity that I had planted in Larissa's head was now alive and well, eager to be satisfied, and she mentioned the subject to her grandfather. "It's a dangerous place. There are bats in the attic, and I don't want you snooping around in there," her grandfather said. That was all he was willing to say about the house, and he quickly changed the subject by asking if we'd like to go horseback riding after breakfast. You'd have to know my wife to know how that wouldn't satisfy her curiosity, and how insistent she can be when she wants something, and to understand my surprise when she simply forgot about it. An hour later, on our way to the stables for a morning horse ride, she looked at me with a twinkle in her eye and told me that we were going to investigate the old house. That was when the third knock came. Grandfather went into town, dust coming out of the ceiling. I took this like someone who had just been told they were going to have a tooth pulled, what sounded like something, but I knew there was no point in contradicting her. And simply that was the last straw for me. After all, it was better. I held Larissa's arm tightly and said, "The last thing I wanted on this peaceful weekend was a grumpy wife, and I already knew that this alone wouldn't do any good." The sun was directly overhead, her eyes was very fixed on the first 3 steps of the stairs leading up to the attic. While her grandparents, "It looks like someone's up there." I hesitated. I don't know about other people. I stood at the doorstep, looking over my shoulder to make sure we wouldn't get a lecture at dinner for anything that has any resemblance to the famous Larissa walked phrases. They're coming to get you, or I hope I never hear this one. Tripping over a horse saddle that was abandoned in front of the door. But I think I would have preferred to have heard something like that. The main room of the house was filled with old something that my rational mind still has, and a large table with a bunch of something that I won't forget for the next 100 years. There was a doorway. The voice was much smaller, smooth and low. Bedroom, I guess, muffled by the ceiling. The entrance to this room was blocked by more boxes. Daniel. Further ahead, on the left, one moment we were in the smaller, half-dark house with a flight of stairs. We were in the bright sunlight with the breeze on our faces. As we ran across the grass lit by a few windows that had it was that fast. Whatever courage was left, for reasons unknown to me, had decided to abandon me, but were now mostly peeling. Larissa had also reached her level of tolerance. The first thing I noticed was how the previous occupants had covered the holes in the walls. Is that my name is not Daniel. Newspaper. Her grandfather is not called Daniel. I saw that I was right, and none of us know anyone. The dates on the newspapers went back to 1930. Even though it is a very common. Larissa, having noticed the strange thing is that you think that after you were out of danger, if we were in danger, was trying to smooth out a large piece that was talking about the Sao Paulo Revolution of 1932. The first thing you would do is sit in a corner. She called me over, talk about what just happened. We were amazed to see that piece of history. But no. We didn't say anything, seeing how something like that could be used to nothing had happened all day. When we heard the noise, it was only at night. Looking back now, unable to sleep, I wish I had a video camera at that moment to record my reaction. I jumped so hard that it felt like my skeleton was going to come out of me and run out and make a hole in the door shaped like me, like a cartoon, even though I wanted to stay calm. But my feet only took one step back before obeying me again and standing there. We were looking up now at the weather-blackened wood of the ceiling. And I started to mutter, "Did you hear that?" when Larissa interrupted me with a ch-ch-ch-ch and a wave of her hand. There was absolute silence in the room for about 30 seconds until I spoke again in a whisper. "It could be the bats your grandfather mentioned. Let's go." But she didn't move. I was about to start complaining about having a ghost hunter for a wife when I heard it again, this time more clearly, not above us, but toward the back of the house. Bats fly, I thought to myself. They don't walk. Our heads immediately turned to the passage on the left, the passage with the old staircase that led to the attic. I asked her if she thought it might be a cat, or if it could be the bats finally falling from where they were sleeping because of the almost 40-degree temperature. But her silence only served to make me more apprehensive. That was when the third knock came, dust coming out of the ceiling, followed by a quieter noise of what sounded like something being dragged across the attic floor. That was the last straw for me. I held Larissa's arm tightly and said, "Let's go." But I know my wife, and I already knew that this alone wouldn't do any good. She whispered, her eyes still fixed on the first 3 steps of the stairs leading up to the attic. "It looks like someone's up there. I don't know about other people, but I don't take kindly to statements like that in these circumstances. Anything that has any resemblance to the famous Horrorfest phrases, 'They're coming to get you,' or 'I hope I never hear this one. They're here,' makes me run like hell. But I think I would have preferred to have heard something like that than what I was about to hear, something that my rational mind still has trouble dealing with, something that I won't forget for the next 100 years. The voice was soft, smooth and low, muffled by the ceiling boards that separated us from the attic. "Daniel, is that you?" One moment we were in the stuffy, half-dark house. The next we were in the bright sunlight with the breeze on our faces as we ran across the grass back to the other house. It was that fast, whatever courage was left in me at that moment had decided to abandon me after hearing that voice. Larissa had also reached her level of tolerance. One important fact is that my name is not Daniel. Her grandfather is not called Daniel, and none of us know anyone called Daniel, even though it is a very common name. The strange thing is that you think that after you are out of danger, if we were in danger, as soon as the adrenaline subsides and the safety of the real world around us descends upon us, the first thing you would do is sit in a corner and talk about what just happened, or what you think just happened. But no, we didn't say anything, not a word, as if nothing had happened all day. It was only at night, in bed, unable to sleep, that we talked about the subject again. She talked about it as if she was walking on eggshells, thinking I would tell her to forget it and not talk about it anymore, but I think that after I got out of the situation, I was able to deal with it more easily. I told Larissa what I thought I had heard, and then came up with a bunch of plausible explanations for what it could have been, ranging from our fillings having picked up a nearby radio station to an old record player that could have been stored away and after 50 years had fallen and turned on, playing a song that we mistook for a ghostly voice coming from beyond. It was much easier to believe that than to think it could be a ghost, but the explanation Larissa came up with there, while we were lying in bed, was scarier than any other. Maybe there is someone living there and my grandfather doesn't know, she said with a worried look. The thought sent shivers down my spine, with images of escapees from some mental institution or prison, creeping onto someone's property in the dead of night. It scared me enough that I got out of bed, went to the window and looked at the old house in the moonlight, actually thinking about going in there with a piece of wood or calling the police to have a look. But we could be wrong about what we heard. There could be some other explanation. And the last thing I wanted, aside from admitting to her grandfather that we didn't follow his orders, was to call the police to investigate something that a young couple's overactive imagination had created. So, we decided that at dawn, we would investigate the house again. This time when we approached the house, without having told her grandparents about our concerns, as this might cause unnecessary worry. I was armed with a shovel I had found on the ground, and Larissa, not entirely convinced that the sounds had come from some earthly source, had a flashlight and a mini recorder that she rarely left the house without. Our second entry was much more orderly than before, and the idea that someone could take up residence in this place was quickly dispelled after a second look at the state of the old house, and realizing that anyone trying to climb the flight of stairs to the attic would probably break the rotten wood and fall to the ground, breaking a leg or worse. We stood there quietly listening in silence for what seemed like an eternity. After a few minutes of standing there, we heard nothing. Only the occasional crack of the old wood expanding in the sun. We decided that we had come too far to simply leave without taking a good look up there, so we began to think of a way to get up. I had seen a fairly new piece of wood, about 6 feet long, about 18 inches wide, and about 4 inches thick, lying in the yard on our way to the house. So I had the idea of going to get it and laying it flat on the ladder, so we could use it as support. Larissa's first attempt to climb it made the old structure groan, which made me ask her to let me reinforce the ramp with some bricks I had seen outside as well. We were doing all this as quietly as possible, because we knew that if we were caught by her grandparents snooping around the house like children, we would get a hell of a lecture. Finally, after about half an hour, we had built our ramp, and after another 5 minutes of arguing over who should go up first, I was kneeling on the wood, slowly climbing up with the shovel in my hand, ready for anything. Larissa insisted that it should be first, but she kept quiet after I said that if there was a crazy person living in the attic, the person armed to defend himself should go first to check. She finally agreed, mumbling, because I married a woman with the courage of 2 men, and I started to climb. By that time, the sun was already strong and was coming through the small holes in the roof, which illuminated the attic enough for me to see everything in front of me. As I assessed whether the old wooden floor would support my weight, I looked around, examining the area. It was strange how the fear that had struck me the day before had completely disappeared, giving way to something stronger, probably coming from the instinct to fight instead of flee, or the instinct to protect my female from whatever was there. Thinking about it now, I really don't know what I was expecting to see there in the attic, but whatever it was, flesh and bones or something else, it was gone. There was nothing, just the remains of some things worn out by time, which led me to think that it was the storage of the previous residence. A headboard of a bed, an old and moldy mattress leaning against a wall, some empty wooden crates, and an old rocking chair falling apart abandoned in the other corner of the room. The attic facing the wall. I stood there looking at the chair until Larissa's voice, coming from behind me, woke me up from my trance. Forget about your theory about the record player. I turned around and saw that while I was analyzing the room, she had gone upstairs. She had the flashlight on and was checking every inch of the attic in front of us. We found nothing. And forget about our theory about some stranger living here, I said, noticing the crust of dust almost 2 centimeters high that covered the entire visible area. If anyone had ever been in that attic, they left a long time ago. I don't know how long we stood there looking around, but it was enough to make me decide that there had never been any fugitives from anywhere looking for shelter there, or even bats. As we turned to leave, Larissa stopped and took a blank cassette tape from her pocket and put it in the recorder. I said, "Forget about it. We're leaving now." But she said she was going to leave the recorder there to record. She put it on the floor of the attic, right next to the entrance. Just to satisfy my curiosity, she said. So we left. We didn't even mention anything we had done during the day, or the day before, to Larissa's grandparents during dinner that night. We had already gotten ready to go back to work the next morning, and we were ready to enjoy the rest of our stay. So we decided not to bother Larissa's grandparents by asking about the other residents, the history of the property, or the possibility of there being spirits that wander around after death. According to Larissa, subjects like these didn't really please her grandfather, who, according to her, thought more rationally than I did. We realized that to get the recorder that Larissa had left behind, we would not only have to use our precarious ramp again, but we would also have to do it very early in the morning so that her grandparents wouldn't catch us inside the house. We decided that we would dismantle the ramp so as not to leave any evidence of our excursion into the house. So we decided that we would wake up around 5 in the morning and sneak into the old house one last time. In the early morning, when we entered it again in total darkness, only seeing what Larissa's flashlight could illuminate, everything was as we had left it. No evidence of paranormal activity. No boxes thrown violently into corners. No footprints in the dust other than ours. I carefully but quickly crawled up the ramp, reached my hand through the trapdoor into the pitch-black attic, and found the tape recorder exactly where Larissa had left it the day before. Quietly, we removed the bricks and placed them neatly on the wall near the front door, then removed the board and placed it against the wall. I was patting my pants to get the dust off when it happened again. The same noise we had heard 2 days before. My first impression was that Larissa had already heard something up there, because when I looked at her, she was already staring at the entrance to the attic, right above us. I looked in the same direction as her, but I couldn't see anything in the total darkness other than the entrance to the attic. This time it was Larissa who spoke first, and she asked me if I had heard it too, but she went quiet after a second knock, this time louder than the first, almost violent, so much so that it knocked a large handful of dust from the ceiling. The horrible, muffled sound of something being dragged, which made the hairs on my whole body stand on end, came right after, and the image that came to my mind was that of someone or something dragging itself along the floor up there, almost over our heads, approaching the entrance to the attic. This time there was no resistance at all in running away from that place once and for all. Almost immediately we were off and running, stumbling through the darkness, and in less than 5 seconds we were through the front door and out into the fresh morning air. But in the back of our minds, moments become an eternity and impressions can become a powerful memory that can last a lifetime. For as we passed through the door of the old house for the last time, we heard the voice again, this time closer, coming from the top of the stairs where we had been just seconds away, this time clearer, harsher, darker, calling to us. And the exact words this time were, "Daniel, I saw you." In the time it took me to run half the distance between the old house and Larissa's grandparents' house, about 50 yards, I had managed to control myself and slowed my pace to a brisk walk, occasionally glancing over my shoulder at the house to make sure everything was okay, that everything was quiet, and that there was nothing following us. Larissa had stopped about 50 feet from the kitchen door and was examining the tape recorder more closely. "It was off," she said. "It stopped halfway through the tape, like someone had stopped it." I tried to convince her that maybe the batteries were dead, but she simply pressed the rewind button and the tape recorder came back to life. It only took a few seconds for the tape to rewind all the way back, and just as she was about to press play, the kitchen door opened and her grandmother was standing there in her bathrobe. "What are you two doing up so early?" she asked. "We were just saying goodbye to the horses," Larissa replied calmly, and soon we were back inside the house, eating breakfast. As soon as we finished breakfast, we packed our bags in the car, said our goodbyes, and hit the road, all the while gazing at the old house. When we got to the main road, Larissa took the little tape recorder out of her pocket and played the tape. I didn't think there would be anything on it, but after we had gone about 2 miles, I pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned off the engine so I could hear the music better. Recording. The first sound on the tape was Larissa's own words, just to satisfy my curiosity. Then the sound of wood creaking and the sound of our footsteps as we left the house. 5 minutes of the tape playing and nothing, just silence, occasionally interrupted by the sound of the house expanding and contracting in the sun. Another 5 or 6 minutes and the sound of a truck driving down the road near the house. Then more silence. Just as the tape was getting to the point where the recorder had been turned off, I heard something. The first impression I had was that it sounded like someone breathing slowly and heavily. I was opening my mouth to tell Larissa to stop the tape, rewind, and play it again that I had heard something, when I realized that the sound was getting louder. From the look on Larissa's face, I could tell that I wasn't hearing things. She was hearing them too. What came next made my spine shiver. The breathing was getting louder, and although I couldn't hear the sound of anything moving, it sounded like something was getting close to the microphone. I was completely startled by the fact that the same tape recorder that Larissa was holding with her shaking hands was now so close, or could even have been touched by whatever was making that noise. The breathing suddenly disappeared, and 10 seconds of silence followed. There was no sound of wood creaking or of any cars in the distance. Then the singing began. It was clearly the voice of an old woman, probably in her 80s or so. Although I couldn't make out the words, I could tell it was a song. A lullaby, perhaps. To this day, I don't know, although I've listened to the tape 100 times since then and amplified the sound in various ways. It's a melody that neither Larissa nor I know, nor anyone who has heard the recording, but because of its dubious nature, it became an interesting topic for conversation among friends who like the subject. But it's not that horrible breathing, or the song that gradually grew louder, being sung by mysterious voices, that to this day, years after the experience, years after the old house was finally demolished, years after Larissa's grandparents sold the property and moved, haunt me in the dark when I'm in bed about to sleep. It's the last seconds of the recording that will always be remembered by me, wherever I go. And for me, they will always serve as proof that no matter how much we try to explain and rationalize the opposite, there will always be things in this life that are beyond the limits of rational explanation. The voice that was singing suddenly stopped, as if it had realized something, and was replaced by a dry, distorted laugh, something insane, while an invisible finger scraped across the microphone and reached for the stop button.